This week, Washington and Riyadh crossed a line that diplomats have been circling for almost 2 decades. The United States has signed a civilian nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia. And buried inside it is a provision that has nonproliferation experts on edge, the possibility that the kingdom could eventually enrich its own nuclear fuel on its own soil. Here's what happened, why it matters, and where this is likely heading next. Stick with us, because this isn't just a Middle East story. It's an energy story, a nonproliferation story, and quite possibly the opening move in a regional dynamic that plays out over the next decade, not the next news cycle. Let's start with the deal itself. On Wednesday, U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright and Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman signed what's known as a 123 agreement, named for Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. It's the legal framework Washington uses whenever it shares nuclear technology, material, or expertise with another country. The U.S. already has more than 24 of these agreements in place, covering over 50 governments. So on the surface, this looks routine. It isn't. Multiple U.S. officials say the agreement opens the door for Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium and potentially reprocess plutonium domestically, after a joint economic study with Washington. That detail is the entire controversy in miniature. Enrichment is the exact process that turns civilian reactor fuel into potential weapons material. It's the same technical capability the United States and Israel went to war to prevent Iran from mastering. Which is what makes the timing extraordinary. This deal arrives while the US and Israel are still actively engaged in a war against Iran's nuclear program, a war that began in February. Washington has spent months arguing Tehran can never be allowed a path to enrichment. And now it's negotiating terms that could hand that same capability to Iran's chief regional rival. The Trump administration's public case is straightforward. Officials call this a multi-billion-dollar, decades-long partnership, a win for the American nuclear industry, led by Westinghouse, and a strategic win against Chinese and Russian competitors who've been courting Gulf nuclear contracts for years. Energy Secretary Wright says the agreement upholds, in his words, the highest standards of nuclear safety and nonproliferation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio echoed that line this week, telling reporters the U.S. would not sign anything that creates proliferation risk. But critics see something else entirely. Compare this deal to the one Washington signed with the United Arab Emirates back in 2009, the so-called gold standard of nuclear nonproliferation. The Emiratis agreed to strict international inspections and gave up the right to enrich fuel entirely. That trade-off became the model every subsequent Gulf agreement was measured against. Saudi Arabia, by most reporting, did not agree to those same terms. The agreement reportedly limits how freely international inspectors can access certain sites. And it leaves the enrichment question open, rather than closed. Think about what that actually means in practice. The 2009 UAE deal essentially said, you get the reactors, the fuel, the technology, but you never touch the part of the process that could be diverted toward a weapon. Every subsequent U.S. nuclear agreement in the region has been judged against that line. This is the first one that appears willing to move it. That's not a technicality. It's a precedent. And precedents in nonproliferation policy tend to travel. Once one country gets a better deal, every other country at the table starts asking for the same terms. Democratic Senator Ed Markey didn't mince words, warning the deal risks igniting a regional arms race. Nonproliferation specialists have raised a related fear, that if Riyadh gets enrichment rights, other Gulf states will demand the same, and the gold standard Washington spent 15 years building simply stops meaning anything. There's also the matter of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself. He said publicly, more than once, that if Iran builds a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will build one too. That's not a hypothetical anymore. It's a stated policy from the man who now controls a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States. So why now? Why did this deal, which has been negotiated in some form since the Obama years, suddenly cross the finish line? 3 forces converged. First, the Iran war. Riyadh has grown increasingly uneasy about depending on Washington for its air defense while feeling shut out of decisions being made about the region's future. This deal is partly reassurance, a way of telling the Saudis they remain the priority partner. Second, competition. Russia and China have both been pitching civilian nuclear programs across the Gulf. Losing Saudi Arabia's nuclear future to Beijing was, for Washington, a strategic risk the administration wasn't willing to accept. And third, decoupling. Previous administrations tied this exact deal to Saudi recognition of Israel. That link collapsed after October 2023, and it never recovered. President Trump made the choice to sever the nuclear track from the normalization track entirely, trading a diplomatic win with Israel for a faster deal with Riyadh. It's worth pausing on that decision, because it reverses years of American strategy. For nearly 2 decades, Washington treated Saudi nuclear cooperation as a prize to be earned, something Riyadh would get only after making peace with Israel. By decoupling the two, the administration essentially removed its own leverage. The nuclear deal is done. The normalization question is still wide open, with no clear incentive left on the table to push it forward. Now, the agreement heads to Congress, which has a mandatory review period. Lawmakers can technically block it, but only if both the House and Senate pass a resolution of disapproval, and then override an almost certain presidential veto. That is an exceptionally high bar. In practical terms, this deal is very likely to survive the review process intact. There's one more wrinkle. The agreement reportedly includes 2 side letters that haven't been made public. The administration says they involve proprietary business terms and sensitive security details. Some members of Congress have already signaled they won't vote on the deal until they see what's inside them. Now let's talk about what comes next. Here's our forecast. In the short term, expect the congressional fight to get loud, but not decisive. Watch for hearings, public letters, and pressure from nonproliferation groups demanding the side letters be declassified. But barring a major leak that changes the political weather, this agreement is likely to clear Congress by autumn, largely along the lines the administration wants. Second, watch Israel's response closely. Israeli officials have already voiced concern privately and publicly. Don't expect a public rupture with Washington, the security relationship is too important to both sides, but expect continued lobbying, and possibly parallel demands for enhanced Israeli defense guarantees as a kind of quiet trade-off. Third, watch Iran. Tehran will almost certainly point to this deal as proof of American double standards, sanctioning Iranian enrichment while opening the door to Saudi enrichment. Expect that argument to show up in Iranian state media within days, and expect it to complicate any future diplomatic track between Washington and Tehran, even after the current war eventually ends. Fourth, watch the rest of the Gulf. If Saudi Arabia secures enrichment rights, the UAE, which gave up that same right in 2009, will face domestic pressure to renegotiate its own agreement. Expect at least preliminary signals from Abu Dhabi within the next year testing whether Washington will offer the same terms it just gave Riyadh. Fifth, and longer term, even if this agreement clears every legal hurdle, actual uranium enrichment inside Saudi Arabia is likely years away. Building enrichment infrastructure from scratch requires technical capacity the kingdom doesn't currently have. The joint economic study alone could take a year or more before any construction decision is even made. This is a legal and strategic green light today. The physical reality on the ground is a much slower story. And finally, watch the International Atomic Energy Agency. Its credibility is quietly on the line here too. If inspectors end up with limited access to Saudi sites, expect the agency to face growing criticism that it's being sidelined in exactly the kind of agreement it was created to oversee. Here's the bottom line. This deal was framed by Washington as an economic and strategic win. And in narrow terms, it probably is one. But it also marks a real departure from nearly 2 decades of U.S. nonproliferation policy in the Gulf, one that trades a firm line for a flexible one, at the exact moment the region is already at its most volatile in years. Whether that trade turns out to be strategic patience or long-term risk will likely take years, not months, to become clear. We'll be tracking the congressional review, the side letters, and the region's response in the weeks ahead. If you want the Gulf's next move explained before it hits the headlines, subscribe to Global Brief. We'll see you in the next one.